What if I told you that the majestic Roman Senate, symbol of power and wisdom, was in fact only a shadow? Its senators, dressed in snow-white togas, believed they ruled the greatest empire in the world. But the real power did not belong to them. Beyond the walls of the Senate, in the barracks and on distant frontiers, other men decided the fate of the throne. They were battle-hardened legionaries for whom the will of their general was more important than any law. Every time the throne was vacant, the Senate tried to regain control, but its voice was drowned out by the clang of swords. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Roman Senate once declared war on an emperor elected by the army, and what this desperate attempt to restore the Republic led to.
Senate will convene in an hour. We must be prepared.
What I am about to reveal changes everything we know about Roman rule. The Roman Senate was the heart of the Republic for centuries, the place where history was made. With the advent of the emperors, it did not disappear, but was transformed into a grand theater. Imagine a political system where the outward forms of democracy are carefully observed, but real power belongs to completely different forces. The Roman Empire was just such a state. If you were a senator in the 1st century AD, you would have understood perfectly well that your impassioned speeches, carefully prepared bills and votes, were a ritual watched over by men with swords whose right of veto was backed by force. Senators, descendants of the most noble families, continued to gather in the magnificent curia. They wore togas with purple stripes, a symbol of their high status. Their speeches were full of references to their great ancestors and glorious past. At first glance, it was they who passed laws, appointed governors, and managed the treasury. Emperors sought their approval to legitimize their power. But behind this facade lay a completely different reality. The Curia Julia, restored by Julius Caesar and completed by Augustus, could accommodate about 300 senators. Inside, there were benches along the walls, and in the center was the altar of victory. Meetings began with religious rituals and could last for hours as speakers delivered their speeches.
Indeed.
The latricula, a wide purple stripe on the toga, was indeed a sign of senatorial dignity. But this outward luxury concealed a growing vulnerability. The Senate formally retained important functions: the administration of some provinces, control of the treasury, aerarium, and the right to mint copper coins. However, the emperor controlled the legions, the military treasury, and had tribunatia potestas, the power of a tribune of the people, giving him the right to veto any decision of the Senate.
Let us now consider the proposed decree.
The real spectator and critic in this theater was the army, and first and foremost the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers, stationed in Rome itself, were the emperor's personal guard. Their loyalty was the main pillar of any power. Emperors appeased the guards with generous payments called donativa. When a new ruler ascended the throne, his first task was to secure the support of the Praetorians. Their swords were far more convincing than any decree of the Senate. The Praetorian Guard was created by Augustus in 27 BC as the emperor's personal guard. Initially, it consisted of 9 cohorts of 500 and 1,000 men each. Under Tiberius, the Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, built a permanent camp, Castra Praetoria, for them in Rome. An unprecedented step, since legions were not traditionally stationed in the capital.
Unwavering discipline is the backbone of
Donations could be huge. Upon ascending the throne, the emperor could pay each Praetorian an amount equivalent to several years' salary. After Pertinac's death in 193 AD, the Praetorians literally sold the empire at auction. Didius Julianus offered 25,000 sesterces to each guard and gained power for 66 days until he was overthrown by the legions of Septimius Severus. The senators understood their position, but continued to play their roles. They were the guardians of tradition and a symbol of legitimacy. However, this legitimacy was worthless without the approval of the barracks. This duality created constant tension in the political life of Rome. The Senate dreamed of a return to its former glory, and the army knew that it was the real master of the empire. Every political crisis became a moment of truth. It tore off the mask and showed who really held the reins of power. And every time the Senate lost this struggle, some senators did try to resist. The Stoic opposition under Nero and the Flavians united senators who criticized tyranny and called for
stand
Republican
firm
ideals.
against tyranny.
Many of them
The
were
soul of the
executed or
Republic
forced to commit
depends on it.
suicide. Trasia Pet, Gelvidus
We
Priscus,
must stand firm,
these are the names of
even
the
in
martyrs of the
darkness.
senatorial class. However, the resistance was doomed. After Caligula's assassination in 41 AD, the Senate briefly discussed restoring the Republic, but the Praetorians had already proclaimed Claudius emperor, and the senators had to obey. The year of the four emperors showed that power belonged to those who had more legions. This balance of power determined the entire future history of the Roman Empire, the eternal dilemma between civil authority and military force. The outcome of this struggle was almost always a foregone conclusion. What do you think? Could civil authority and principle have withstood organized military force in those days? Are you ready to learn the truth about the Senate's first desperate attempt to turn back the tide of history? In 41 AD, the reign of Emperor Caligula was coming to an end. His assassination as a result of a conspiracy by officers of the Praetorian Guard opened up an unexpected window of opportunity. For the Senate, it was a long-awaited chance to regain power. Imagine the moment when, after 4 years of insane tyranny, the despot who had kept everyone in fear suddenly disappears. A power vacuum ensues. If you were a senator at that moment, you would feel a dizzying mixture of hope, fear, and the realization that the next few hours would determine the future of Rome for centuries to come. You have a window of a few days to change the course of history. What would you do? The senators immediately gathered on Capitol Hill in the Temple of Jupiter. They began to passionately discuss the restoration of the Republic. There were calls to erase the very memory of the emperors and restore Rome to its former freedom. These debates continued for almost 2 days. Speakers took turns painting pictures of a revived republic, where the Senate would once again become the highest authority. It seemed that the dream was about to become reality. But while the senators were indulging in speeches, the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard were taking action. They roamed the empty palace in search of loot, and behind one of the curtains, they found a frightened man. The conspiracy against Caligula was led by the tribune Cassius Chaerea, whom the emperor constantly humiliated. The murder took place on January 24th, 41st AD, in an underground passage of the palace. It was not a senatorial conspiracy. The killers were soldiers acting on personal motives, although some senators may have been aware of it. The Senate did indeed convene and debate the restoration of the Republic. The consuls Gnaeus, Sentius, Saturninus, and Quintus Pomponius Secundus led the discussions. Republicans such as Valerius Asiaticus spoke. However, these debates revealed the fundamental weakness of the Senate, a lack of unity and a practical plan of action. The senators argued about the form of government, but did not control a single legion. That man was Claudius, Caligula's uncle. He was a scholar, not a politician, and never sought power. The Praetorians, however, saw him as the ideal candidate. They immediately proclaimed him the new emperor. This decision was made without any involvement of the Senate. The soldiers simply chose the person who, in their opinion, would be beneficial to them. The Senate was presented with a fait accompli. Their debates about the Republic proved meaningless. The real power of the Praetorians had already made their choice. The story of Claudius hiding behind a curtain is known from sources, but its authenticity is disputed. It is probably a literary topos intended to show the randomness and comicality of his ascension. Claudius did indeed suffer from physical disabilities, possibly cerebral palsy or polio, which made him the object of ridicule. But he was an educated man and a historian. The Praetorians chose Claudius for pragmatic reasons. He was the last adult male of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Proclaiming him emperor ensured dynastic continuity and legitimacy, which was important to the guards themselves. Claudius, brought to the guards' barracks, promised each soldier a huge sum of money. This was the first time in history that the loyalty of the army had been openly bought. A precedent had been set. The senators had no choice but to approve the Praetorians' choice. They granted Claudius all imperial powers. Their dream of a republic collapsed before it even began. This episode was a bitter lesson for the Roman aristocracy. It clearly showed that the era of the Senate was irrevocably over. From now on, the fate of the throne would be decided not by debate, but by brute force. In the next chapter, you will learn how the senators did manage to win once, but at what cost. Claudius promised each Praetorian 15,000 sesterces, a truly enormous sum, equivalent to about 3 or 5 years of a legionnaire's salary. However, this was not the first donative in history. Augustus and other rulers also made payments to the troops. What was new was the openness of the deal, power in exchange for money, without the cover of ideology or tradition. Some senators tried to resist for a few more days. Part of the city cohorts, under the command of a senatorial officer, held the capital. But the legions on the Rhine and in other provinces supported Claudius, and the resistance collapsed. By January 25th, the Senate capitulated and recognized Claudius as emperor. The lesson was brutal. Without control of the army, the Senate was powerless. Republican ideals could not stand up to the legions in the Praetorian Guard. I will reveal the Senate's best-kept secret to success. In 96 AD, the reign of Domitian, the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, came to an end. His assassination as a result of a palace conspiracy created a new crisis of succession. This time, the Senate acted swiftly and, surprisingly, wisely. Imagine a political elite that had learned its lesson from 50 years of failure. After the fiasco of 41 AD, after the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD, when the legions decided the fate of the throne in a bloody civil war, the Senate finally understood the rules of the game. If you were a senator in 96, you would have known that you had a few days at most before the provincial armies began to put forward their candidates. Time was a critical resource. The senators understood their past mistakes. They realized that they could not simply proclaim a republic or choose someone who was unpopular with the army. They needed a compromise candidate who would suit everyone. Their choice fell on one of the oldest and most respected senators, Marcus Coccius Nerva. He was already over 60, had no children, and had no ties to the army. At first glance, he was a weak candidate, but his weakness was also his strength. Nerva did not inspire fear in other senators, as he could not found a new dynasty. He was the ideal transitional figure, a symbol of a return to the old order. Nerva was about 65 years old when he ascended the throne, which was an advanced age by Roman standards. He came from a respectable but not distinguished senatorial family. His career was successful, but not military. He was consul twice, but never commanded legions. This was his main weakness, and at the same time his advantage. He posed no threat to anyone. The choice of Nerva was a strategic compromise. He was respected enough for the Senate to support him, old enough and childless enough not to create a dynasty, and weak enough not to frighten the military. It was a choice of diplomacy, not strength. The Senate proclaimed him emperor on the same day that Domitian died. This was done so quickly that none of the provincial generals had time to declare their claims. The first round went to the Senate. However, Nerva and his supporters understood that this was not enough. The Praetorian Guard was dissatisfied with the change of power and demanded justice for their former patron. The new emperor's position was extremely precarious. Domitian was assassinated on September 18, 96. The conspiracy involved courtiers, including the Chamberlain Parthenius, and possibly Domitian's wife, Domitia. The Senate did act quickly, proclaiming Nerva emperor on the same day. This prevented the emergence of rival claimants from the legions. However, Nerva's reign was crisis-ridden from the outset. In 97, the Praetorian Guard, led by Prefect Caesarius Aelianus, took Nerva hostage, demanding the execution of Domitian's murderers. The elderly emperor was humiliated and forced to hand over the conspirators. This incident revealed his weakness and the need for military support. Then Nerva made a brilliant political move that changed the entire history of Rome. He publicly adopted one of the most popular and influential generals of the time. That general was Marcus Ulpius Trajan. Trajan commanded a powerful army group on the German border. He enjoyed boundless respect among the soldiers. His adoption immediately secured Nerva the loyalty of all the legions. This act was the height of political wisdom. The Senate did not confront the army, but on the contrary, won it over to its side. They chose the best of the generals and made him their ally. Trajan's adoption took place in October 97. probably under pressure from circumstances following the crisis with the Praetorians. Trajan was governor of Upper Germany and commanded 4 legions. He was a native of the province, but had a brilliant military career and was respected by the army. However, the idea that this was solely the Senate's idea is an oversimplification. The decision was most likely dictated by political necessity. Nerva needed a defender with military power. Trajan was the obvious choice, but it was a choice of weakness, not strength. Thus began the golden age of the Roman Empire, the era of the 5 good emperors. A unique mechanism for the transfer of power was created. The ruling emperor adopted the most worthy candidate, ensuring a peaceful transition, and it was the Senate that invented this system. This romanticized interpretation needs to be clarified. The system of adoptive succession was not a consciously developed political program, but rather a series of fortunate circumstances. Nerva adopted Trajan out of necessity. Trajan adopted Hadrian. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, who adopted Marcus Aurelius. This sequence worked because emperors happened to be childless or their biological children died young. When Marcus Aurelius had a surviving son, Commodus, he immediately transferred power to him, despite his unsuitability, and the system collapsed. This was not a wise policy of the Senate, but a stroke of biological luck. The Golden Age was real. The 2nd century AD was a period of relative stability and prosperity, but to attribute this to the wisdom of the Senate or a conscious system is to overestimate the role of planning and underestimate the role of chance in history. Guess what happened next when the throne of Rome was literally put up for sale? The end of the 2nd century was turbulent. After the end of Commodus's reign in 192, crisis struck again. The first emperor supported by the Senate was Pertinax. He was strict and tried to restore order, including by curtailing the excessive privileges of the Praetorian Guard. This decision cost him his power. After only 3 months, the Praetorian Guard put an end to his reign. The Senate was horrified but could do nothing. The guards felt they had complete impunity. And then an event occurred that became the greatest disgrace in the history of Rome. The Praetorians announced that they would give the throne to whoever paid the most. They held a real auction. There were 2 contenders. One was the father-in-law of the late Pertinax. The other was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. The bidding took place right outside the walls of the Praetorian camp. The soldiers shouted out their terms and the contenders raised the price. In the end, Didius Julianus won. He promised each guard a fabulous sum of money. The Praetorians escorted their chosen one to the Senate. The senators, under threat of swords, were forced to approve this upstart. The Roman Empire was officially sold at auction. News of this shameful event quickly spread throughout the provinces. The commanders of the border legions were furious. They refused to recognize the authority of the emperor who had bought the throne. 3 generals immediately proclaimed themselves emperors and led their troops to Rome. They were Septimius Severus in Pannonia, Pescennius Niger in Syria, and Clodius Albinus in Britain. A new bloody civil war began. The Senate no longer played any role in this struggle. It could only passively watch as the generals decided the fate of the empire on the battlefields. Which of these 3 would prove to be the strongest? The winner of the civil war was Septimius Severus, an experienced and ruthless commander. He entered Rome without a fight. Didius Julianus was abandoned by everyone and soon lost power. Severus' first act was to deal with the Praetorian Guard, which had staged a shameful auction. He disbanded the old guard, recruited from Italians. Instead, he created a new one from soldiers loyal to him from his Pannonian legions. This step was symbolic. It showed that from now on, power in Rome would be based not on the intrigues of the capital, but on battle-hardened border troops. The center of power had finally shifted from the city to the provincial military camps. Septimius Severus did not flirt with the Senate, as many of his predecessors had done. He was a soldier and ruled like a soldier. He openly demonstrated his contempt for the senatorial aristocracy. Many senators who supported his rivals were stripped of their positions and wealth. Severus did not seek compromise. He ruled with an iron fist, relying exclusively on the army. His policy was simple and cynical. He significantly increased the salaries of the legionaries. Soldiers were allowed to marry during their service, which tied them even more strongly to the army. He left his sons, Caracalla and Gaeta, a famous will. Its essence boiled down to one phrase: live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, and pay no attention to anyone else.
This is a dangerous
This
path.
was the quintessence of the new military monarchy. Under Severus,
We cannot
the
defy
Senate
the
finally
emperor.
lost the remnants of its political influence. It
There is
became a
nothing
decorative
left for us
body
to
that
do.
obediently approved the emperor's will. All key positions in the state were now held by the military. The emperor was no longer first among equals, as he had been before. He became a military dictator whose power rested solely on the loyalty of the legions. Septimius Severus laid the foundations for a new system of government. The era of covert military
long
rule
have
was
we
over.
endured the
It was
weakness of
replaced
others.
by an open military
Now,
dictatorship. The Senate
rise.
learned this lesson, but there was nothing it could do about it. What if I told you that the Senate once officially declared war on the ruling emperor? This happened in 238, which went down in history as the year of the six emperors. It was the Senate's last desperate attempt to regain power. Imagine a situation where the parliament of a modern state declares its president an enemy of the people and elects two new leaders, preparing for civil war. This is exactly what happened in 238 AD. If you were a senator at that moment, you would understand that you were voting not just for a change of power, but for a war that could end either in an incredible victory or in the complete destruction of your class. It all started with a rebellion in the province of Africa. The local aristocracy rose up against Emperor Maximinus Thrax. Maximinus was the first soldier emperor, a man of humble peasant origins, whom the army had elevated to the throne. The Senate hated Maximinus for his lowly origins and disregard for tradition. When news of the uprising in Africa reached them, the senators saw their chance. They immediately supported the rebels. The uprising in Africa was quickly suppressed, but the Senate had already crossed the line. Realizing that Maximinus would not forgive them, they went all in. Maximinus Thrax was indeed the first emperor to rise from the ranks of ordinary soldiers. He was called the Soldier Emperor because he was chosen by the army without any involvement from the Senate. He ruled from 235 to 238 AD and ushered in an era of military anarchy in the 3rd century. The rebellion began in February 238 in the African province. The local proconsul and large landowners rebelled against Maximinus's harsh tax policy, which financed his endless military campaigns. They proclaimed the 80-year-old proconsul Gordian Marmus and his son Gordian II as emperors. However, the uprising was not suppressed quickly in the full sense of the word. The legate of neighboring Numidia, Capellianus, loyal to Maximinus, attacked the rebels. Gordian II was killed in battle, and Gordian I committed suicide. This happened about 20 to 22 days after the proclamation, but news of the uprising had already reached Rome. The Senate officially declared Maximinus an enemy of the state. This was an unprecedented step. Instead, they elected two of their own emperors from among the senators, Pupienus and Balbinus. Pupienus was an experienced military leader and was entrusted with organizing the defense of Italy. Balbinus was a respected administrator and was to rule Rome. The Senate was preparing for a real war against the legitimate but unwelcome army. After the death of the Gordians, the Senate found itself in a dangerous position. They had already supported the rebellion and could not back down. In April 238, they elected a commission of 20 people to organize the defense, and then proclaimed two emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus. This was an attempt to divide power, military and civil. However, the Roman plebs and praetorians were dissatisfied with this choice and demanded that Gordian I's 13-year-old grandson, Gordian III, be included in the government. Thus, there were effectively three emperors at the same time, which created instability. Maximinus Thrax, who was on the Danube border, flew into a rage. He deployed his battle-hardened legions and marched on Rome. He intended to punish the rebellious Senate and drown Italy in blood. All of Italy prepared for defense. Cities were fortified, bridges were destroyed, and militias were assembled. The senators personally led the preparations for war, investing all their resources in it. It was a unique moment in the history of the empire. For the first time, the civil authority, represented by the Senate, openly challenged the military power, represented by the emperor and his army. The fate of Rome was to be decided in this confrontation. Maximinus did indeed march on Italy in the spring of 238 at the head of the Danube legions. His army was veteran and disciplined. The Italians massively supported the Senate, not out of love for the senators, but out of hatred for Maximinus and his cruel methods. The cities of northern Italy closed their gates to Maximinus. Aquileia, a rich fortress city in northeastern Italy, became a key point. Maximinus laid siege to it in April-May 238. It seemed that the Senate's chances were slim. Against Maximinus's professional legions, they could only field a hastily assembled militia. But what happened next? The siege of Aquileia dragged on. The city was well fortified and supplied. Maximinus's army suffered from food shortages and low morale. The soldiers were exhausted from years of campaigning and did not want to fight against Italian cities. In late May or early June 238, officers of the II Parthian Legion rebelled and killed Maximinus and his son in their tent. Their heads were sent to Rome. The Senate won without winning a single battle. Maximinus's army destroyed itself. However, the Senate's triumph was short-lived. Already in July 238, Pupienus and Balbinus were killed by the Praetorian Guard, dissatisfied with their exclusion from power. The young Gordian III remained emperor, ruling under the control of the military. The Senate lost again. Maximinus Thrax's troops invaded Italy. They expected an easy victory but encountered desperate resistance. The Senate managed to organize the defense better than anyone could have imagined. The key moment was the siege of the city of Aquileia. This city in northern Italy refused to open its gates to Maximinus. Its inhabitants, inspired by the Senate's appeals, decided to stand their ground to the end. The siege dragged on. Maximinus's army, experiencing supply problems, began to grumble. The soldiers were unhappy that they had to fight on Italian soil against their own fellow citizens. A conspiracy was brewing in the emperor's camp. The soldiers were tired of endless war and the cruelty of their commander. One day they simply entered Maximinus's tent and put an end to his reign. The news reached Rome and caused widespread jubilation. The Senate had won. The emperor, elected by the army, was removed, and power now belonged to their protégés, Pupienus and Balbinus. It seemed that Republican ideals had triumphed. The senators celebrated their victory, believing that they had managed to turn the tide of history. But their triumph was short-lived. The problem remained in Rome itself. It was the Praetorian Guard. From the very beginning, the guards did not trust the senatorial emperors. They felt humiliated. After all, it was they, the guards, who had always chosen the rulers. And now the Senate had appropriated this right for itself, relying on some distant militia. The tension between the new emperors and their own guards grew with each passing day. Pupienus and Balbinus did not trust the Praetorians and even planned to replace them. The guards, in turn, were preparing a counter-move. The victory over the external enemy, Maximinus, only exacerbated the internal conflict. The Senate won the war but failed to win the loyalty of those who carried weapons in the very heart of the empire. The finale of this drama was tragic and predictable. The short reign of Pupienus and Balbinus ended as it had for many before them. The Praetorian Guard, dissatisfied with the Senate's rule, staged a coup. Both emperors were captured and stripped of their power. This episode marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods in Roman history, the crisis of the 3rd century. The next 50 years were an era of almost continuous civil war. Emperors succeeded one another with kaleidoscopic rapidity. A wide variety of people became emperors. They were Illyrian peasants, Arab sheikhs, and Gallic aristocrats. The only thing they had in common was the support of the legions. Almost all of the soldier emperors of this period did not live to old age. They ruled for several years and sometimes months before being overthrown by their own soldiers. The army, which had learned to create emperors, destroyed them just as easily. Some of these rulers were outstanding military leaders. Emperors such as Aurelian and Probus won brilliant victories over external enemies and attempted to restore the unity of the empire. But even they could not cope with the main problem, the instability of the system itself. The loyalty of the soldiers was fickle. It depended on generous payments in military victories. Any failure or delay in payment could lead to mutiny and the emergence of a new pretender to the throne. All political life boiled down to a simple question: who do the legions support? No one cared about the opinion of the Senate, the Roman people, or the aristocracy anymore. The empire turned into a military dictatorship torn apart by internal conflicts. This era clearly showed what happens when military power completely dominates civil institutions. Rome paid a terrible price for this. The empire was on the verge of complete collapse. Why did the Roman army acquire such enormous political power? The roots of this phenomenon go deep into history, long before the appearance of the first emperor. It all began with the reforms of the commander, Gaius Marius, at the end of the 2nd century BC. Imagine the moment when military service ceased to be a civic duty and became a profession. This fundamentally changed the relationship between the soldier and the state. If you were a Roman peasant before Marius' reforms, you would serve for a few seasons and then return to your farm. Your loyalty would belong to Rome as a whole. After the reforms, everything changed. Before Marius, the army was a militia of citizens who bought their own equipment. After serving, they returned to their peasant farms. Such an army was loyal to the Senate and the people of Rome. Marius opened up access to the army for the poorest sections of the population. The state began to provide them with weapons and pay them a salary. Military service changed from a civic duty to a profession. Soldiers now served for 16-20 years. They spent their entire lives in military camps on distant borders. Their only home was the legion, and their only authority was their general. Marcus's reforms were indeed a turning point. Before that, only citizens who owned certain property could serve in the legions. This ensured that soldiers had an economic interest in the stability of the state. They were defending their property. Marcus abolished the property qualification, recruiting capite censi, citizens counted by head, i.e., proletarians who had no property, into the army. The state supplied them with weapons and armor. This solved the problem of recruitment during the Jugurthine War, but created a new problem. Soldiers without property depended on military service as a source of income. It was the general, not the Senate, who provided soldiers with spoils, rewards, and land after retirement. Soldiers developed personal loyalty to their commander. The legions turned into a kind of private army of successful military leaders. The first civil wars in Rome, between Marius and Sulla, and then between Caesar and Pompey, were fought by such armies. Even then, it was clear that whoever controlled the legions controlled Rome. The Senate could only choose which general to support. The key problem was that the Senate had never established a systematic system for providing for veterans. Generals promised their soldiers land after service and lobbied the Senate for agrarian laws. Soldiers understood that their future depended on the success of their commander, not on abstract loyalty to the state. The first time the Roman army turned against Rome was in 88 BC, when Sulla led his legions to the capital to overturn the decision of the popular assembly that had transferred his command to Marius. It was a shocking precedent, the first time a Roman general had used the army against his own state. The first emperor, Octavian Augustus, was the most cunning of these generals. He concentrated all the armies under his command, but pretended to rule in agreement with the Senate. He created the illusion of preserving the Republic. But the reality was different. The entire system was based on his personal control over the armed forces. Subsequent emperors inherited this system. Thus, from its very inception, the empire carried within it the seeds of military rule. As long as strong and authoritative rulers were in power, the system worked. But in times of crisis, it inevitably failed. And then the army took center stage. Augustus was indeed a master of political camouflage. After his victory at Actium, 31 BC, he controlled about 60 legions. He demobilized most of them, leaving 28 legions, about 150,000 men, and created a permanent professional army with fixed salaries and pensions through a special military fund. Critically, only the emperor commanded all the legions. The senatorial provinces had no legions, only auxiliary troops. The emperor was the only link between the state and the army. Over time, the Senate lost all leverage over the troops. It did not pay their salaries, appoint their commanders, or lead them into battle. It became a distant and incomprehensible authority for the soldiers. with no real authority. This was a structural defect inherent in the foundation of the Roman Empire that was never corrected. Military power and political authority were inextricably linked in one person, the emperor. When imperial power weakened, the army filled the vacuum by choosing new emperors. The crisis of the 3rd century AD, when more than 50 emperors changed in 50 years, most of whom were killed, was a logical consequence of this system. The crisis of the 3rd century ended with the rise to power of Diocletian. He was another Illyrian general proclaimed by the army, but unlike many of his predecessors, he managed not only to seize power, but also to hold on to it. Imagine an empire on the brink of collapse. In 50 years, more than 50 emperors had come and gone. The borders had been breached by barbarians. The economy was in ruins. The plague had wiped out a third of the population, and the provinces were seceding. If you were Diocletian in 284 AD, you would understand that the old methods no longer worked. What was needed was not cosmetic reform, but a complete overhaul of the system. Diocletian realized that the old system created by Augustus no longer worked. The illusion of joint rule by the emperor and the Senate had collapsed. Radical reforms were needed to match the new reality. He created a new system of government known as the dominate. The word dominate comes from the Latin dominus, meaning lord. The emperor ceased to be the first senator and became an absolute monarch whose power was not limited by any laws. Diocletian and his successors finally removed the Senate from the administration of the empire. A career in the Senate was no longer a path to high public office. All affairs were now managed by a ramified military and civil bureaucracy that reported directly to the emperor. Diocletian ruled from 284 to 305 AD and carried out radical reforms. He created the Tetrarchy, a system of rule by 4 emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars. This was an attempt to solve the problem of succession to the throne and the defense of the empire's vast borders. The term dominate truly reflects the change in the ideology of power. Under the Principate, emperors were formally republican magistrates with extraordinary powers. Under the Dominate, they became Eastern monarchs with a divine aura, surrounded by complex court ceremonies borrowed from Persia. The Senate was not dissolved. It remained as a symbol of the great past. But its functions were reduced to governing the city of Rome, and it became a kind of city council. Moreover, Rome itself ceased to be the center of the empire. Diocletian and his co-rulers governed from other cities located closer to the troubled borders. Nicomedia, Mediolanum, and Trier became the new capitals. This process was completed by Emperor Constantine. He founded a new capital on the site of the Greek city of Byzantium, naming it Constantinople. It was there that the center of political life moved. The geographical shift was logical. Rome was far from the critical borders on the Rhine, Danube, and Euphrates. The emperors needed to be closer to their armies. Nicomedia was in Asia Minor, Mediolanum in northern Italy, and Trier near the German border. Constantine founded Constantinople in 324-330 AD in a strategically ideal location, between Europe and Asia, controlling the straits, easily defensible, with an excellent harbor. It became the new Rome, but without the Senate as a real political force. The Roman Senate continued to exist for several more centuries. Its members still bore impressive titles and were proud of their ancestors, but it was only a shadow of its former glory. The struggle for power between the Senate and the army was over. The army won, but it was not the soldiers or generals who reaped the rewards of this victory. It was the idea of an absolute, unrestricted monarchy based on military force that won. The paradox was that the militarization of power ultimately led not to a military dictatorship, but to a bureaucratic monarchy. Diocletian and his successors created a huge administrative apparatus that controlled the army itself. Military leaders became officials in the chain of command, rather than autonomous commanders with their own armies. The separation of civil and military power at the provincial level, the increase in the number of provinces with a decrease in their size, and the creation of a mobile field army separate from the border troops were all aimed at preventing military coups. Thus ended the 1,000-year history of the Roman Senate as a governing body. It began as a council of elders under the first kings, led Rome to world domination during the Republican era, and quietly faded into the shadow of the military emperor's throne. Its history became an eternal reminder of the fragility of civil power in the face of organized force. The Roman Senate formally existed until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, and even after that for several decades under the Ostrogothic kings. The Senate of Constantinople, created as a parallel body, survived until the fall of Byzantium in 1453, although its role was ceremonial. The history of the Senate indeed demonstrates a fundamental problem. Institutions of civil government are powerless against organized violence unless they control it themselves. This lesson is still relevant today. We have traced the long and dramatic history of the confrontation between the Roman Senate and the army. This story is not just a collection of facts from the distant past. It is a vivid example of how the nature of power changes and how political institutions can lose their real significance, retaining only their external form. Every time a power vacuum arose, the Senate tried to realize its dream of returning to the old order. But each such attempt was shattered by harsh reality. Those who hold weapons dictate their own rules. From auctioning off the throne to officially waging war against its own emperor, the Senate tried everything but lost. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in a specific period of Roman history or another civilization. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new research on the most exciting pages of the past.